At my daughter's wedding, my son-in-law's mother stood up during the toast and told everyone the house I'd lived in for 31 years now belonged to her family. I set down my glass, walked to the microphone, and asked her to repeat that in front of the 200 people watching. The next afternoon, there was a sheriff's deputy standing on her porch with a folder in his hand. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 66 years old, and before I tell you what happened on that porch, I need to tell you how a wedding turned into the worst betrayal of my life. Because none of it happened by accident, and none of it happened quickly. If you've ever watched someone try to take what isn't theirs and get exactly what they deserved, stay with me to the end. And if stories like this matter to you, hit like and subscribe, because I've got more of them to tell. I built my house on Cattleman Ridge Road outside of Boise, Idaho, back in 1993. I was 32 years old then, working as a foreman at a lumber yard, and my wife Ellen was 6 months pregnant with our only daughter, Mallory. We didn't have two nickels to rub together most years, but we had 4 acres of land and a house I'd framed with my own two hands, board by board, on weekends and evenings after work. Ellen wallpapered the nursery herself, hummingbird print, still up to this day. I laid the stone path from the driveway to the front porch myself, one flagstone at a time, over the course of an entire summer. We raised Mallory in that house. We watched her ride her bike down that gravel driveway, watched her leave for college in Pocatello, and watched her come home 4 years later with a business degree and a boyfriend named Gavin Whitfield. Ellen passed away 5 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Diagnosed too late to do much about it. After she was gone, it was just me rattling around in a house built for a family of three, with a garden she used to tend gone to weeds and a kitchen that felt too quiet in the mornings. Mallory worried about me out there alone, and I understood why, even if I didn't love hearing it. So when she told me she and Gavin wanted to get married and settle down close by, maybe even build a little guest house on my land so they could keep an eye on me as I got older, I was more relieved than I let on. I thought it sounded like exactly what a family was supposed to do for each other. I didn't know then that Gavin's mother had been circling that idea for months before Mallory ever brought it to me, and that keeping an eye on me meant something very different in that woman's mind than it did in mine. Gavin's mother was named Regina Whitfield. She was around my age, twice divorced, and she ran a small real estate office out of a strip mall in Meridian that mostly handled foreclosures and estate sales. She was the kind of woman who complimented your house the moment she walked into it and somehow made the compliment sound like an appraisal. The first time she visited my property, before the wedding was even set, she walked the 4 acres with her hands clasped behind her back like she was measuring it for something, and she asked me, almost offhand, whether I'd ever had the land surveyed for subdivision. I told her no, and that I had no plans to. She smiled at me the way you smile at a child who's said something naive, and she said, "Well, you never know what the future holds, Walter." I let the comment go. I told myself I was being an overly suspicious old man, same as anybody might be about a new in-law they hadn't warmed up to yet. Looking back now, I understand that comment was the first move in a plan that had already been sitting in her head for longer than I wanted to believe. The wedding planning took the better part of a year, and in that time, I noticed Regina inserting herself into details that had nothing to do with her. She had opinions about which contractor should build the guest house on my land. She had opinions about whether my property should be retitled into some kind of family trust for tax purposes, a suggestion she brought up at Thanksgiving dinner like she was doing me a favor. Mallory, sweet as she is, thought Regina was just being thorough, just being helpful the way some mothers-in-law try too hard to be. I never said a bad word about Regina to my daughter, not once, because Mallory was happy, and I loved seeing her happy after watching her grieve her mother for years. But I noticed things. I noticed how Regina referred to my 4 acres as the family's land within earshot of me, like the deed had already changed hands. I noticed she'd asked my daughter, more than once, whether I had a will and whether the property was set up properly in case anything happened to me. I told myself it was just an overbearing woman with a real estate background who couldn't help herself. I was wrong to let it go on as long as I did, but I loved my daughter more than I trusted my gut, and at the time, that felt like the right thing to do. About 3 months before the wedding, my nephew Cole came to see me on a Sunday afternoon while everyone else was at a cake, tasting 2 towns over. Cole was 31, worked as a title examiner for a real estate law firm in Boise, and he was the kind of quiet, careful young man who noticed things other people missed. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I used to help Mallory with her algebra homework, and he had a manila envelope in his hands that he set down like it was something fragile. He told me he'd been doing some digging on his own time. Nothing official, just curiosity after hearing Regina talk about the family's land one too many times at a family barbecue. He asked me to keep the envelope somewhere safe and not to open it in front of Mallory or Gavin. I asked him why. He looked at me and said, "Uncle Walter, just trust me on this. If anything ever seems off with the property, open this first before you do anything else." I laughed a little and told him he'd been watching too many crime shows. He didn't laugh back. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager, caught in a lie, something between worry and certainty. I took the envelope without opening it and locked it in the fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet, the same box where Ellen used to keep our marriage license and Mallory's birth certificate. I didn't ask more questions that day, because Cole looked like a man who'd already made up his mind that something was wrong, and I trusted him completely. That envelope sat untouched in my closet for 3 months, and I had no idea it would end up being the only thing standing between me and losing everything. The wedding was held on the second Saturday of June, out on the back lawn of a vineyard 40 minutes from Boise. String lights strung between the trees, and 200 folding chairs set up in rows, facing an arbor covered in white roses. Mallory looked like her mother standing up there. Same dark hair, same nervous smile she got right before something important. I walked her down the aisle myself, and I'll admit I cried more than I expected to, thinking about how much Ellen would have loved seeing this. The ceremony was beautiful. The dinner afterward was warm, full of laughter, the kind of evening that makes all the hard years feel worth it. I sat at the head table, and for a few hours, I let myself believe that everything really was going to be all right. The toast started around 9 o'clock, after the cake had been cut. Gavin's father went first, a quiet, decent man who mostly talked about how proud he was of his son. Then it was Regina's turn. She stood up with a champagne glass in her hand, tapped it twice with a fork, and the room went quiet the way rooms do for a mother of the groom. She started off fine, talking about how Gavin had always known what he wanted, how Mallory had brought light into their family. Then her tone shifted, and she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, smiling the whole time like it was a joke everyone was supposed to laugh at. And of course, now that these two are starting their life together, it only makes sense that the Cattleman Ridge property will finally be in the family's name the way it should have been all along. Walter's been generous enough to understand that. She raised her glass like she'd just announced something warm and expected, and for one horrible second, half the room actually started to raise their glasses back, unsure of what they'd just heard, assuming it must be true, because why else would a mother of the groom say it out loud at a wedding? I did not raise my glass. I set mine down on the white tablecloth, slow and deliberate, and I felt something in my chest go completely still, the way water goes still right before it turns to ice. I thought about Cole's envelope sitting in my closet. I thought about the survey comment, the family trust suggestion, the family's land remarks I'd let slide for over a year, because I didn't want to make waves before my daughter's wedding. I stood up from the head table, walked to the small stage where the DJ had set up his microphone, and I asked the DJ, politely, if I could borrow it for just a moment. He handed it over without hesitation. I looked out at 200 faces, at my daughter in her wedding dress with her mouth slightly open, at Gavin looking like he wanted the earth to swallow him, and I looked directly at Regina Whitfield and asked her, calm as I could manage, to repeat what she'd just said, because I wanted to make sure everyone in this room heard it clearly, the same way I had. The room went dead silent. My neighbor of 22 years, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Dunmeyer, was sitting 3 tables back, and he later told me he'd never seen a room go that quiet, that fast outside of a funeral. Regina's smile faltered for just a second before she tried to recover it, saying something about how she only meant it as a nice gesture, that she didn't mean to cause a scene. I told her, into that microphone, in front of my daughter and my new son-in-law and 200 witnesses, that the property on Cattleman Ridge Road had been in my name since 1993, that it would remain in my name, and that I hoped she understood the difference between a family being generous and a family being taken advantage of. Then I handed the microphone back to the DJ, walked back to my seat, and finished my dinner. I did not raise my voice again. I did not make another scene, but I also did not let it go. The reception limped along after that, polite and stiff, the way a party does once everyone's had the air let out of it. Mallory found me near the gift table about an hour later, her makeup slightly smudged from crying in the bathroom, and she asked me if what Regina said was true, if I'd actually agreed to sign the land over. I told her, honestly, that I had never agreed to anything, that I had never even been formally asked, only hinted at for the better part of a year. She hugged me so hard I nearly lost my footing. and she told me she had no idea Regina had been saying things like that behind closed doors. I believed her completely. My daughter has her mother's heart, and she would never have let something like that happen to me on purpose. This wasn't about Mallory. It never was. It was about a woman who had been circling my land since before the invitations went out, and who thought a wedding toast in front of 200 witnesses was the moment to finally close the deal in public, banking on the idea that I'd be too embarrassed or too polite to correct her. I drove home alone that night, the reception still going without me, and I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long while before going inside. The house was dark and quiet, same as it had been most nights since Ellen passed, except now it felt different, like something had shifted underneath it that I couldn't yet see. I went to my bedroom closet, pulled out the fireproof lockbox, and for the first time in 3 months, I finally opened Cole's envelope. Inside were three things that changed the shape of everything I thought I understood. The first was a copy of a preliminary title report Cole had pulled from the county assessor's office, showing that 6 weeks earlier, someone using Regina's real estate license number had initiated an informal inquiry into subdividing my 4 acres into three separate parcels, the kind of inquiry typically filed by a property owner or someone with legal authority over the land, not by an unrelated third party. The second item was a printed email chain Cole had come across through a colleague at his firm, one that showed Regina had been in contact with a document preparation service that specialized in what the industry calls quiet title filings, paperwork used to try to establish or transfer ownership claims, sometimes legitimately, but sometimes to manufacture a paper trail where none should exist. The third item was a note in Cole's own handwriting, explaining that he'd overheard Regina at a family gathering months earlier telling Gavin that once he and Mallory were officially settled, it would make sense for Walter to add both of their names to the deed as a gift, and that Gavin had brushed it off as his mother's usual overreach, never realizing she intended to make it happen with or without anyone's real consent. I sat at my kitchen table and read through that envelope 3 times, and by the third time, my hands weren't shaking from grief anymore. They were shaking from something closer to clarity. My nephew, a young man with no real stake in any of this beyond loving his family, had spent months quietly watching a woman circle my property, gathering evidence before anything had even happened, because something in his gut told him it eventually would. I folded everything back into the envelope, and for the first time since that toast, I did not feel like a foolish old man standing alone in an empty house. I felt like a man who finally had the full picture. The next morning, I called Cole before I'd even finished my coffee. He wasn't surprised to hear what had happened at the wedding, he told me, because 2 weeks earlier he'd heard through a mutual contact at the title company that Regina had scheduled a follow-up appointment with the document preparation service for the Monday after the wedding, the very next business day. Whatever she'd been planning, the toast wasn't the plan itself. The toast was her trying to soften the ground in public before the real paperwork went through quietly, assuming that once the family believed the land was already spoken for, nobody would look too closely at how it actually got transferred. I asked Cole what I should do, and he told me the same thing he'd told me 3 months earlier when he first handed me that envelope. He said this needed to go to someone who actually practiced property law, not just someone who understood it from the title side. He gave me the name of an old law school friend of his, a woman named Priscilla Antoine, who'd built a career in Boise handling exactly this kind of property fraud case. I called her office that same afternoon. Priscilla Antoine was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, and had a way of listening that made you feel like every detail mattered, because to her, it did. I drove into her office 2 days later with the envelope, the lockbox, and every scrap of paperwork I had on the house going back 30 years. She spread it all out across her conference table and went through it piece by piece without saying much, occasionally making a note, occasionally asking a short, precise question. When she finally looked up at me, she said the informal subdivision inquiry alone wasn't illegal by itself. Real estate agents pull those kinds of records all the time out of professional curiosity or on behalf of clients who haven't decided anything yet. But paired with the document preparation service correspondence, and paired with what Regina had said out loud in front of 200 witnesses at a wedding, it painted a picture of someone actively laying groundwork for a fraudulent transfer, one that hadn't been completed yet, which Priscilla told me was actually the best possible timing for me, because we could get ahead of it before any paperwork was ever filed with my actual signature forged onto it. She asked me one simple question before we went any further. Walter, do you want to just quietly shut this down and protect your property, or do you want this woman held accountable for what she's already tried to set in motion? I thought about Cole spending 3 months quietly protecting a family that had no idea he was doing it. I thought about Regina, standing up with a champagne glass in her hand, ready to announce my land as already gone, banking on the idea that an old widower wouldn't embarrass his own daughter at her wedding by correcting her. I looked at Priscilla and said, "Hold her accountable. All of it." Priscilla moved fast once I gave her the go-ahead. She filed a formal request with the Ada County Recorder's Office to place a fraud alert on my property title, a legal safeguard that flags any attempt to file new paperwork against a deed until the flag is manually cleared. That single step, she told me, would stop any quiet title filing dead in its tracks the moment it hit the county system, no matter who tried to push it through. She also sent a formal cease and desist letter to the document preparation service Regina had been corresponding with, along with a copy to the Idaho Real Estate Commission. Since using a licensed agent credential to pull preliminary subdivision records on land, you have no ownership interest in raises serious professional licensing questions, separate from any criminal exposure. Within a week, the Real Estate Commission had opened its own inquiry into Regina's conduct, and that inquiry moved faster than any of us expected, because it turned out Priscilla's letter wasn't the first complaint the Commission had received about Regina Whitfield's office. Two other complaints from unrelated families, both involving elderly property owners and both involving similar quiet title maneuvering around family land, had been sitting in the Commission's queue for months. My case was the piece that finally gave them enough to act. The following Monday, the exact day Regina had scheduled her follow-up appointment with the document service, an investigator from the Idaho Real Estate Commission showed up at her office in Meridian instead, along with a request for records related to my property and the two other open complaints. Cole heard about it secondhand from his colleague at the title company before I even heard about it from Priscilla, and he called me practically breathless, telling me Regina's assistant had described the investigator's visit as the quietest kind of chaos, papers being gathered, phone calls being made behind a closed office door. 2 weeks after that, Regina's real estate license was suspended pending a full investigation, and the Ada County Recorder's fraud flag on my property stayed active, permanently blocking anything from being filed against my deed without my personal, notarized, verified signature going forward. Priscilla told me that given the pattern across 3 separate families, criminal charges for attempted fraud were still being considered by the county prosecutor's office, but that even without criminal charges, Regina's real estate career in the state of Idaho was effectively finished. Mallory took it hard when she found out the full extent of what her mother-in-law had been doing behind the scenes, harder than I expected, honestly. She sat with me on my back porch one evening, about a month after the wedding, looking out at the same 4 acres I'd raised her on, and she apologized for something that was never her fault to begin with. I told her what I'm telling you now. None of this was about her, or even really about Gavin, who it turned out had brushed off his mother's comments for years because he genuinely believed she'd never actually try to act on them. This was about a woman who saw a grieving widower and a happy young couple, and decided that grief and happiness were both opportunities to be managed rather than respected. Gavin, to his credit, didn't make excuses for his mother once the full picture came out. He drove out to my place on his own without Mallory, about 2 weeks after the investigation became public knowledge in certain circles around town, and he sat across from me at the same kitchen table where Cole had first handed me that envelope. He told me he was ashamed, that he'd spent years assuming his mother's comments about the family's land were just harmless overreach from a woman who talked big and never followed through, and that he should have shut it down the very first time he heard her say it, instead of laughing it off. I appreciated him saying it, and I told him so. I also told him that the measure of a man isn't whether his family embarrasses him, it's what he does once he finds out the truth. He nodded, and we sat there a long while, not saying much else, just two men who'd both underestimated the same woman. Regina never spoke to me again after that Monday morning, and she hasn't spoken much to Gavin either. From what I understand, though that's between the two of them and none of my business to comment further on, the last I heard she'd relocated to Nevada to be closer to her sister, her real estate license still suspended, the investigation still technically open. I don't know if she ever truly understood what she almost took from me, or if she simply saw it as a plan that didn't work out. I've stopped wondering. Some people spend their whole lives measuring what they can take from others instead of what they can build, and there's no envelope, no lockbox, no lawyer that can fix a heart built that way. As for me, I still live in the house on Cattleman Ridge Road, same 4 acres, same stone path I laid, one flagstone at a time, the summer before Mallory was born. Cole comes out most Sundays now, and we sit on that back porch and talk about nothing in particular, though I always make a point of thanking him, even now, for trusting his gut when nobody asked him to. Mallory and Gavin did eventually build that guest house they'd talked about before the wedding, close enough that I can see their porch light from mine. And some evenings, Mallory walks over just to sit with me the way she used to as a girl. No envelope, no lawyer, no ulterior motive, just my daughter, coming home. I think about that wedding toast sometimes, the sound of 200 glasses almost raised before anyone realized what they were toasting to. I think about how close it came to slipping past everyone, how easily a woman, confident enough, could have turned a lie into a fact just by saying it loud enough, in front of enough people, at exactly the right moment when nobody wanted to make a scene. I didn't stay quiet because I was weak that night. I stayed calm because calm was the only thing that let me think clearly enough to ask her to say it again. And clear thinking was the only thing that ended up saving everything I had left. I lost my wife years ago, and there isn't a lawyer or a deed in the world that brings that kind of loss back. But I kept my land. I kept my daughter's trust. And more than anything, I kept the truth of what almost happened, clear and documented, so that nobody in my family ever has to wonder what really occurred that night at the vineyard. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.